Well, greetings and salutations, test takers. This is the Series 7 Guru coming to you from my studio here in fabulous Las Vegas with our next episode in our podcast series, episode 8, margin accounts. So I will provide a link in the video description and the pinned comments to the full margin lecture or margin class replay. Let me know what you would prefer, live class replay or a recorded lecture. One or the other. Maybe I'll pin both. But the title of the lecture is Don't Overdose on Series 7 Margin. There's only 3 or 4 questions in this area, and all test prep vendors go way overkill on margin. I mean, if you tell me you missed your mark on Series 7 because of margin, I'm going to say, hey, you had bigger problems elsewhere. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what those 3 or 4 questions are. So that means we probably got to do a little more work than is necessary. If you want to do more than that, I'm warning you, I think your time is better spent elsewhere. However, I felt bad. Somebody wanted tutoring on a bunch of hellacious margin questions. And if you go to tutoring replays, you can watch her and I do a bunch of margin practice questions together. Anyways, that being said, we want to make sure we always pick the low-hanging fruit, right? And so you definitely should know margin account documentation, the additional documentation necessary to open a margin account. And the first part of that documentation is the credit agreement. The credit agreement is mandatory, and that's where the client says he understands that he's borrowing money and he's paying interest. The interest he's paying is based on broker call. Broker call is what banks charge brokerage firms for money. And when we hypothecate or rehypothecate customer securities, whenever the bank typically charges the broker-dealer then relends that to the customer at broker call plus. This can still be a very competitive loan for a customer where they want to borrow money to purchase securities or whether they want to just borrow money. They want their SMA as cash or they want to use it as buying power. It can be a very competitive loan. Credit agreement is mandatory. A hypothecation agreement is mandatory. The hypothecation, that's just a fancy word for pledging securities as collateral, right? If I go into my pawn shop and say I want to hypothecate my Rolex, that means I'm pledging the Rolex as collateral for the loan. So that's what hypothecation means. So that means your securities, this says your customer acknowledges mandatory, that they understand that they're pledging their securities as collateral for the loan, that they don't fulfill the responsibilities, we're going to sell them out. And that's very important because that means the securities are in street name. Street name means the name of the broker-dealer. So, when you open a cash account, I say, listen, in a cash account, you have a choice. I say, would you like to put your securities in street name, the name of the broker-dealer? It'll be a lot easier operationally backstage if we do so, but it's your choice. In a margin account, you have no choice. The securities will be in street name. Now, that means a lot of proxy material that issuers send to shareholders, when they look at their shareholder list, it looks like the broker-dealer, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, it looks like they own the securities. That's not true. That are Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley margin customers whose securities are in street name. So when we get that proxy material from the issuer, the broker-dealer, we have to forward that to those customers at no charge. Now, the third document in the margin documentation is not required, and this is called the loan consent form. This is where we tell the customer, we have other customers who wish to establish short positions. Would it be okay to lend our other customers your securities that you're long? And the customer says, well, Dean, I don't think it's in my best interest to be lending my securities to customers who want to go short the security. I say it's not, and that's why the loan consent form is optional. So, when somebody wants to borrow money or borrow securities, they must open a margin account. If they want to borrow securities, I say, well, let me call Stock Loan and see if we have any customers who have signed the loan consent form and said it's okay to lend their securities to customers like you. There is a locate requirement. By the way, we hope we can get it internally through Stock Loan, but we can also borrow that elsewhere. Main point is the loan consent form is not mandatory. It's optional. Now, prior to 1934, we as broker-dealers were in charge of credit extension to our customers. And when we were in charge, that was called the Roaring 20s. You'd give me 10 grand. I'd loan you 90 grand to purchase securities, and heck, I'd lend you money to buy anything you want. What do I care? At the end of the roaring 20s, there was a crash. And we decided that maybe broker dealers aren't the best decision makers about credit extension to customers. And so Reg T is a part of the Securities Act of 1934. And ultimately, it says the Federal Reserve Board is the one in charge of credit extension of broker dealers to customers. And one of those is what's called Reg T. And Reg T says the Fed will establish how much a customer needs to initially be at risk. Right now, Reg T is 50%. So if you buy 1,000 shares at 40, that's $40,000. As a margin clerk, say, do you want to do this in your cash account? Do you want to pay in full? Or do you want to do this in your margin account? Would you like us to lend you part of that purchase price? You say, well, Dean, let's do it in my margin account. I say, okay, so you have to put up initially $20,000, 50%. Now, there are certain securities that the Federal Reserve Board says are ineligible or non-marginable, meaning we can't lend you money to buy them, and we can't extend you credit. The two big ones to be aware of on the Series 7 are new issues. We don't lend you money to buy a new issue. It's considered a new issue 30 days from the effective date. We don't lend you money to buy options. There are exceptions, and there's more of those, but those are the two big ones. I told you, don't overdose on margin. So, get into the weeds here. There are certain accounts that are ineligible for margin. What we mean by that is they must be cash accounts. The big one we test on is retirement accounts and UTMA accounts. You can't, as a custodian, leverage up the kid and say, hey, it didn't quite work out, something about a maintenance call. No. So big ones to be aware of on your test. It must be cash accounts or retirement accounts and UTMA accounts. We also have different types or, subcategories of margin accounts. We have portfolio margin accounts, and the minimum equity in a portfolio margin account is $100,000. The upside to having a portfolio margin account is the maintenance and the requirements are dynamic in terms of scoring. In other words, if you are short the stock and you got a call, you don't have unlimited risk, and we'll score that accordingly. And your maintenance calls don't need to be met promptly. Day trading accounts, you should definitely know the definition of a day trading account. It's when somebody does 4 or more day trades within a 5 business day period. And the test question is the minimum equity is $25,000. They're also going to get to have more leverage, be allowed to use more leverage. I told you portfolio margin is 100 grand. These are aim and shoot point and click recognition questions, and they're dynamic margin requirements. Stupid but testable. Stupid but testable. I don't know why FINRA loves this question. It's on the SIE. It's on your Series 7 that we're discussing presently. If you're going on to a Series 9 or 10 or 24, it's there as well. So first trade in a new account, or another phraseology you might encounter on your exam is initial transaction. So the self-regulatory organization, this isn't Federal Reserve Board is the point, this is FINRA, says that the minimum equity in a new margin account is $2,000. Now, the trick on the test is there's 2 versions of this trick question on the test. Initial transaction, you buy 100 shares at 18. And you say, Dean, I know how margin accounts work. 100 shares at 18. Let's open a new account. Let's do it in my margin account, $900. I said, well, if you had an established margin account with me, that would be correct. However, FINRA, the SRO, has a minimum of $2,000. He said, well, I'll send you $2,000. I go, whoa. Why would you want to send me $2,000 to buy $1,800 worth of stock? This is very testable. You're just going to pay in full. So $2,000 or less in a new margin account, initial transaction, customer pays in full, period, full stop. Second version of this trick question, very testable. You say, Dean, sounds like a wonderful idea. Let's open a new account. Let's buy 100 shares at 30. And I know how margin accounts work. I'll send you $1,500. I said, well, if you had an established account with me, that would be correct. But we have a minimum of $2,000. So you need to send me $2,000. So between $2,000 and $4,000, the customer must deposit $2,000. over 4,000, there's no trick. It's just like any other margin account in terms of the initial deposit. So loan value is how much I can extend in credit against collateral, right? I had a customer one time, I'm dating myself, but this is the early 90s. And, until the early 90s, banks and brokerage firms were separate things. You couldn't be a bank and a brokerage firm. And anyways, he couldn't get a loan at the bank. And I said, well, gee, Mark, why can't you get a loan? Then they said, well, Dean, they asked me if I had a job. And I said, I didn't have a job. And then they said, no job, no loan. I said, well, Mark, did you tell them you don't have a job because you're rich? And he said, well, no. I said, well, listen, you have $5 million in fully paid for securities. I can extend you a loan of up to $2.5 million on that $5 million in fully paid for securities. Or, Mark, I can let you buy another $5 million of securities with that $5 million, right? 10 million minus 5. So that loan value is how much the customer can borrow against the collateral, right? Loan value. The classical margin equation is long market value minus debit equals equity. I think the best analogy here is a house. Market value of the house minus mortgage on the house equals equity on the house. Equity represents what you would have if you sold the house and paid off the loan. Nobody's suggesting you do that. And, some banks might say, hey, you have excess equity in the house. You have more equity in the house than is necessary. Would you like to borrow against that? We could hook you up with an excess equity line of credit against the home. You say, yeah, I'd love that. I'd say, great. Now be careful, because when you write that check, the mortgage on the house goes up and the equity goes down. Right? You're drawing it. The only way you get your own equity of the house is to sell it. So that's a good analogy for what's going on in a margin account. Now, if you just spend, margins, when I teach live classes, who knows, we could teach a live class again. And I ask people, what do they want help with? They say margin and options. I said, well, let's be very clear. Options is the bigger deal. I'm going to help you on both, but let's be clear. Options is a bigger deal. However, in both options and margin, if you can figure it out, then you're going to want a whole bunch of these questions, because there's no way to really trick you. Right? So what I mean by that is, if you can do the initial setup, customer buys 1,000 shares at 40, makes the required deposit. So you should be able to say, okay, that's $40,000 in securities. We're going to loan him $20,000. That's the debit register. Equity is 20. That's what he needs to deposit. That's going to be called his margin call, the call for initial money. Now, we really don't tell customers this, but under Reg T, customers get 2 additional days to come up with this $20,000, right? So if I'm a margin clerk, T plus 2 is between broker dealers. Customers get 2 additional days, so I can't really, bother them until T plus 2 plus 2. Whether you want to think of that as T plus 4, or you want to think of that 2 days after settlement, however you want to think about it. They go, hey, where's your 20 grand? And now if you're a customer in good standing, I may get you an extension. Then I give you a mailgram, you flake, where's your money? And let's say I sell you out. And so by the time I sell you out, that stock is a $50 stock. So you bought 1,000 shares at 40. I sold you out at 50. You never paid for the buy. So I say, you free rider, you took a free ride, a ride you did not pay for. Now I have to send them the $10,000 profit in this example, but then I'm going to freeze his account for 90 days and say, listen, for the next 90 days, you have no credit privileges. What's frozen is not the ability to trade the account. What's frozen is the credit privileges. We have very liberal credit privileges at a broker dealer. So if you violate our already liberal credit privilege, it's going to be a problem. All right. So that's our classical margin equation. And I said we just did an initial setup where we bought 1,000 shares at 40. Customer made the required deposit. 40,000 minus 20,000 equals 20,000 in equity. Again, I realize this is a podcast. You may be listening in the gym, driving to work. Who knows? Maybe you're watching it on the YouTube channel. Who knows? And I get that. If you want to see ledger entries and marks, you can do 2 things. You can watch the lecture I'm going to pen and put in the video description. You go also on the channel search bar and just enter margin and see all kinds of practice questions that I've helped people out, individual practice questions. And you can also watch tutoring replays. So there's a lot of that. I'm trying to keep it pretty simple in this podcast series. So stock goes to 50. In this case, the customer did make the required deposit. He still has the 1,000 shares. I did not sell him out. And so now we're going to do what's called a mark to market, So now there's $50,000 in market value securities. The mortgage, the debit balance is still 20. You have $30,000 in equity. Again, the best analogy is the house, right? If the house goes up, the market value of the house goes up, the mortgage remains the same. And sometimes they like to ask you what ledger entries are affected based on certain market action. And please note here, the debit register wasn't altered. But you now have, in this example, $30,000 in equity. I say, listen, you only need to be at risk for half of 50, which is 25. That's Reg D. 50% of, that 50,000 is 25. You have 30. You have 5,000 in excess equity, more than you need. For customers like you that pick stocks that go the right direction, we're willing to advance you a further loan. Would you like $5,000 in cash, or would you like to buy additional securities? With $5,000 in excess equity, you have $10,000 in buying power. And you say, well, Dean, do I have to do something today? I say no. If I told you had to do something today, you might use this in a way that's not in your best interest. So I say, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a special memorandum to your account that on today, you had $5,000 more than you needed. Now, for test purposes, I don't think you'd have any problem on the exam thinking of excess equity and SMA as the same thing. They're not actually. The SMA is the holding tank for the excess equity. So you say, hey, Dean, I like it at 40. I'm glad that it's at 50, but 50 is a little rich for me. So I don't feel like increasing my proportion ownership today. Like it at 40, don't like it at 50. I say, I totally understandable. Tell you what, I'll make a special memorandum to your account. Stock goes back to 40. And I say, hey, you said you liked it at 40 and it's back at 40. You go, damn, I don't have any excess equity. I said, you're correct. You don't. With the stock back at 40, 40 minus 20 is 20. Aren't you glad I made that special memorandum to your account? You still have $5,000 you can have as cash. You could still buy $10,000 worth of additional securities. So 2 times the SMA is the buying power. Now, more often than not, the test questions aren't about good news. Leverage is financial speed. You're making money twice as fast. So in my example, where we bought 1,000 shares at 40, stock went to 50. If you did that in your cash account, you put up 40 grand and you made 50, it's 50 and, you sell, you made $10,000. And if you buy 1,000 shares in your margin account at 40 and you sell at 50, you made $10,000. But in your cash account, you put up 40 to make the 10. That's a 25% return. That's decent for sure. But in your margin account, you only put up 20 to make the 10. You've made 50%. So leverage is financial speed. Now, what we need to make sure the customer understands is that the same supercharged speed they make money with, it's the same supercharged speed they're going to lose money with. You say, well, Dean, this is all great fun, but, isn't there bad news at some point? I say, well, okay, well, yeah, to maintain your account, you always need to have a minimum of 25% of the market value in equity. Now, remember, house requirements can always be more stringent. I don't know of any brokerage firm that doesn't have a house requirement that is more than 25, but that would be the minimum. You say, well, Dean, how far down could my account go before there would be a problem? And I said, well, gee, why you sound negative energy like that? I said, well, I can figure that out. I take the debit register, market value at maintenance is debit by 0.75. Now, be careful. In our simple margin account we're kind of using for illustrating this podcast episode, we bought 1,000 shares at 40. We made the required deposit. Be careful what you're being asked. In that example, if I ask you, what is minimum maintenance? You'd take 25% of 40 and you'd say minimum maintenance is $10,000. Different question. If I ask you how far down the account could go before there would be a problem, that's market value of maintenance. And we would take our debit register, 20,000. We would divide by 0.75 and we come up with 26,666. Sign of the devil. I say, listen, if this stock goes below $26.66, where there's 1,000 shares here, or 26,000 market value goes below $26,666, you're going to have a maintenance call. You know, maintenance calls are due promptly unless you have a portfolio margin account. If I'm a margin clerk and you owe the broker-dealer money, any cash from stocks, cash dividends from stocks or interest from bonds will be used to pay down the debit balance, right? So if I'm a margin clerk, you have a debit balance with the brokerage firm, cash comes into your account, I'm going to pay down the loan. If you don't want the margin department to do that, the margin clerk to do that, well, then you got to expressly say, Dean, you know, don't pay down the loan. Now, remember, if I pay down the loan, that means equity would go up. All right. So in most businesses, when you sell things you don't own, it's called fraud. But not in our business. You can sell things you don't own. That's called selling short. Selling borrowed securities. So whether I want to borrow money or borrow securities, I need a margin account. And let's say I call my broker and I say, I'd like to borrow 1,000 shares of SeaWorld. And they say, Dean, let's call stock loan and see if we have a customer who signed a loan consent form that has 1,000 shares of SeaWorld in their account. There is a locate requirement. This is called regulation SHO, SHO, short locate requirement. They say, Dean, we were able to locate 1,000 shares of SeaWorld. I say, sell it short. And let's assume SeaWorld is a $50 stock. So I'm going to get 50 grand from selling the borrowed stock. But remember, Reg T says I have to put up half. So I'm going to have to put up 25 grand. So the credit register, that's the cash. The credit register is $75,000. So that's the cash. Minus the short market value, in this case, 50,000, equals equity. So that is our classical short equation. Credit register minus short market value equals equity. Remember, the classical margin equations are important. By the way, when I say classical margin equation or classical balance sheet equation, that just means that we assume everybody knows that, right? So if we assume everybody knows it, you should be able to recognize that as a standalone kind of test question. You know, the classical short equation, margin equation can best be described as, and you got to pick it out of the lineup, so to speak, right? Anyways, back to this. We got our initial setup. Remember, the reason we said this is important is we want to be able to do the initial, and then we want to be able to do what's called a mark to market. So here I'm bearish on SeaWorld, right? You know, you know, I'm hoping bad news, you know. Maybe one of the orcas chomps on a trainer. That would be good news for me. And the stock, as a result, drops to, you know, 40, right? I'm hoping to sell high and buy low. So that's what I'm hoping. And as I said before, more often than not, it's not the good news that you sell short and the stock goes down. You know, it's the bad news. You know, as I always say in all my, you know, lectures as a result of being a bear, I say, don't be a dumb bear. You know, you should definitely be able to recognize that when you sell short securities, you have unlimited risk. You say, well, Dean, what is minimum maintenance on a short position? I say, well, minimum maintenance on a short position is 30%. So you need 30% of the short market value. So in my example, I sold short 1,000 shares of SeaWorld at 50. 30% of that is 15,000. Right now, I don't have any problem because, you know, I don't have a problem right now. Again, be careful what you're being asked. You know, I always express this to test takers as RTFQ. Read the full question. Make sure you are distinguishing between asked about what is minimum maintenance and what is market value at maintenance. Those are different questions, right? So, you know, minimum maintenance is 30. Now, remember, house requirements can always be more stringent. They just can't be more lenient. I don't know of any firm that does it. You say, well, Dean, how far up could SeaWorld go before there would be a problem? I said, oh, that was on my Series 7. I'm going to take the market value, market value maintenance. I'm going to take the credit, in this case, 75 grand. That's where most people get on. Where the 75 grand come from? 50 grand from selling the stock I didn't own, plus the 25 I had to put with it. That's $75,000. I divide by 1.3. I'll just get my calculator right here. and 75,000 divide 1.3. If SeaWorld, the stock goes up, remember it's 1,000 shares per share, it goes above $57.69 a share, you're going to have a problem. If it goes in market value in total, if it goes above $57,692, you're going to have a problem. And again, if you want to do ledger entries and see the math on a whiteboard, like I say, just go on the channel and do that. So that means it's very important to consider risk mitigation, particularly in a short stock position. In a short stock position, you might want to consider two risk mitigation strategies. We have two areas in our quiver, and as I say, don't be a dumb bear. And so if you don't want to be a dumb bear, you could buy a protective call. You could establish the choice to buy back the borrowed stock at a set price at any time between now and some future date. Very important to know that hedging, right? On a long stock, you would buy a put. Here, the other thing you can do, maybe you're not approved for options, for example. The other thing you could do is enter a buy stop order to stop the loss. So, let's put in a buy stop at SeaWorld let's put in a buy stop at 57. At that point, I'm going to go home, right? I'm going to stop the losses, stop the bleeding. At some point, we got to admit this is not a flower, it's a weed, and it needs to be pulled. Now, the equivalent on the long stock would be a sell stop, right? So I would know risk mitigation, by the way, is way more important in a short account because of the unlimited risk. But risk mitigation for the short stock position would be buy a call. Then you no longer have unlimited risk, or enter a buy stop order to stop the loss. I would also know risk mitigation in a long account, however, not as testable, but that would be the opposite, right? We'd either buy a put or enter a sell stop. Okay, so I hope you found these are finding the podcast series helpful. Episode 9 will be customer accounts. We're trying to bring these in about 30 minutes. And I will, again, link to the full-blown lectures on margin for you in the video description and the pinned comment. Remember, inch by inch, your Series 7 is a cinch, and yard by yard, your Series 7 is hard. And I'll see you for episode 9, customer accounts.